Thank you, friends. Welcome, Mr. Vice President. My assignment from Amity is to give a brief introduction. I'm happy to do that. I'm an abiding fan of the Vice President. I think he will go down in history as one of America's greatest Vice Presidents. We've had some really great ones, starting with John Adams and Teddy Roosevelt and Harry Truman. It's hard to think of any who has been more intensely tested than the Vice President we're about to hear from. In fact, I met Mr. Pence only once, back when he was a congressman. I doubt he'd remember it. The encounter was on the sidewalk in front of the Harvard Club of New York. I'm not accusing, just to be clear, I'm not accusing Mr. Pence of having been inside the Harvard Club. This was on the sidewalk. He was with a mutual friend, as I recall it, Steve Forbes, which might be why, when we were introduced briefly, I leaned over and said to Mr. Pence, "Did I hear you're for the gold standard?" I'm reluctant to repeat what Mr. Pence replied because I hadn't informed him that I was with a newspaper. But it was a substantive several sentences, and I don't think it's a violation of ground rules to disclose that when I got home that evening, I said to Amity, "I shook hands today with Mike Pence. He strikes me as a man to watch." And he went on to be governor of Indiana, of course, and history kept calling. One day when Mr. Pence was vice president, he showed up without a fanfare at Plymouth Notch, Vermont, to see where, 100 years ago almost, Coolidge was sworn by his own father to the presidential parchment. When the press said to Coolidge's father, who said, "You could swear in the president," he said, "Who said I couldn't?" Few, if any, of our leading politicians have come as much as Mr. Pence has to embody the virtues of Coolidge, a combination of modesty, strong religious faith, a sense of budgetary rectitude, and what I like to call constitutional courage. Mr. Coolidge famously displayed his courage when, as governor of Massachusetts, he faced down the Boston police strike, cabling Samuel Gompers the immortal words, "There is no right to strike against the public safety by anyone, anybody, anywhere, anytime." Vice President Pence famously showed his courage on January 6, 2001, amid the riot, he refused to leave the Capitol, bent as he was on returning to his duty to, as the Constitution puts it, open all the certificates, close quote. Mr. Pence has given us a deeply affecting account of this in his new memoir, "So Help Me God." It's a wonderful title, by the way, and an extraordinary book. It recounts how, after a harrowing conversation on January 5, when he informed the president that the Constitution didn't grant the vice president the powers to do what the president wanted, Mr. Pence went back to his own office, sat down, and looked around the portraits: Jefferson, Adams, Teddy Roosevelt, Coolidge, and one who wasn't vice president, Lincoln. And he found himself thinking of the book of Hebrews and the cloud of witness who observes everything we do, and the call to, quote, "Throw off everything that hinders," close quote, end quote. "Let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us," close quote. Then the vice president bowed his head, folded his hands, and prayed, "Yes, the New York Sun noted admiringly, right there on government property. And then he went on to cleave to the Constitution with a greater display of courage than any other vice president. No vice president has shown a greater display of courage, and I think it will be studied for generations to come. Mr. Vice President.
Seth, thank you for that overly generous introduction. I'm deeply humbled by it. Abraham Lincoln said his only ambition in life was to be esteemed by people he esteemed. And so I thank you for your esteem. And I also want to thank your extraordinary wife, a gifted writer, but someone who loves history. Would you all join me in thanking Amity Schlaze for her work at the Calvin Coolidge Presidential Foundation and bringing forward this Coolidge Centennial Conference. Incredible. She is soft-spoken, but she's a freight train. I'll never forget, after I made that visit, Seth, that you referred to Plymouth Notch, where we thought we'd slip in very quietly with our 18-car motorcade. It wasn't too long before I got a phone call from one of my favorite authors who said, "I heard you were at Plymouth Notch, and I would like your help with a Calvin Coolidge Foundation as we approach 100 years since he took the oath of office, and here we are with extraordinary leaders and a rising generation of conservative young people." So thank you, Amity. And I'm deeply humbled to be here with a number of my heroes that I would be prepared at. Back in the days in Congress, we used to say, I yield the balance of my time. But to be in the room with the likes of Governor John Sununu, one of the great governors in the history of this country, one of the greatest chiefs of staff in the history of the White House, and to be here with Chris Cox, who I served with in Congress, I think to this day remains one of the most optimistic, positive, forward-thinking conservatives in America. Congressman Chris Cox is with us. Thank you, Chris. And of course, to actually be sharing the room with a friend and a colleague who I know has played a leading role in the work of the Coolidge Foundation. Congressman French Hill, thank you. Thank you for caring so much about our history and this great legacy. And finally, when I think about economic freedom, when I think about a defense of free markets in print and on the airwaves and in the public debate, there are few names in that pantheon of greater consequence than the name of Steve Forbes. And Steve, thank you for defending economic freedom for all these years and for the honor of being with us today. And thank you all these bright young people. I'll be available for a few more selfies later. Thank you for such an incredibly warm welcome. You know, Calvin Coolidge wrote, we draw our presidents from the people, and it's a wholesome thing for them to return to the people. And I have. Frankly, what's true of presidents is also true of congressmen and governors and vice presidents. And I am here today from my home in Indiana, which you may have seen on television recently. After 4 years of extraordinary service as your vice president, we're back in the heartland where we belong. Now, my life has changed a lot since we were last together. Not only did we move back home, but also I bought a riding mower. John Deere 54-inch deck, 0-turn radius. I get to drive my own lawn. One of the nice parts about no longer being vice president is you get to drive your own car. One of the bad parts is you get to pay for your own gas. But the biggest news in our life is that in our first year out of office, we welcomed our first grandchild, and last week we welcomed 2 new granddaughters in 2 days. The Pence family is growing. We couldn't be more blessed. Karen and I figured out we actually had children so we could have grandchildren. But it's a joy to be with all of you. I must tell you, holding little Elena Marie, born last week to the second daughter to our Marine and his incredible wife, I'm holding little Etta Rose, born to my daughter Charlotte and my unworthy son-in-law, Lieutenant Henry Bond. It gives you pause, doesn't it? It gives you pause about the importance of reflecting on the past, knowing where we've come from, but also gives you even a greater weight of responsibility about the future and preserving our inheritance of freedom and the values that have made this country great come into higher focus. And that's why I didn't want to miss today the opportunity to say thank you. Thank you to all of you for supporting the Coolidge Foundation and its incredibly important mission of teaching this next generation to love our country, to cherish our Constitution, and to advance the principles and values synonymous with America's 30th President, Calvin Coolidge. Thank you all. I'm especially honored to be here with so many Coolidge scholars, young people that are wearing the badges who are among the best and the brightest this country has to offer. You were selected through a tremendously competitive process and chosen by merit. And I know everyone here is proud of you. We're counting on you. It's going to be your turn one of these days. And I know you're going to serve America with great distinction. Join me in thanking all these Coolidge scholars for stepping up. You know, a lot of people consider Calvin Coolidge one of the forgotten presidents, but he was never forgotten to me. Especially during my time as vice president. As Seth just shared, the first time I walked into my office in the West Wing, I saw portraits of John Adams and Thomas Jefferson on the walls that my predecessor had hung, the first and the second vice presidents. And they remained there for the rest of our tenure in office. But I added a couple more paintings. One was of Teddy Roosevelt, who his contemporaries described him as pure energy, which I concluded must come out of New York about every 100 years. The other portrait I could relate to a little more, and that was the portrait of Calvin Coolidge. And I must tell you, my love for Calvin Coolidge dates back to my youth and my study of history, but it was greatly enlivened by the epic biography written by Amity Shlaes. I believe her book perfectly captured Silent Cal's character, his personality, and his philosophy. In fact, when I was vice president, there's a small library of works about and by vice presidents that's in the library at the Naval Observatory. And I remember one sunny Sunday afternoon when I had a few moments after church to grab a book, and I pulled Calvin Coolidge's autobiography off the shelf, first edition, and sat down and read it in an afternoon. And I want to thank the Coolidge Foundation for putting Calvin Coolidge's autobiography back in print and available for every American. Amity, your words about him, his words, in a book much shorter than my book, a lot shorter than my book, evidence of his brevity and economy of words, or my lack of it, inspired me greatly. And I've been inspired since by his humility, his principled conservative leadership that resonates into our time in new and in renewed ways, and by his deep devotion to the Constitution of the United States. You know, there were many times when I was vice president that I would look around the room at those luminaries on the wall and be inspired by them. As Seth said, in one particular moment, I reflected on those words of the Bible that remind us that we are surrounded by a great cloud of witnesses. So let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles, and run with perseverance the race marked out for us, as surely he did in his time, and inspires us still. Surrounded by those portraits, remembering those who have gone before, we set out to do our duty. And let me just take this moment to say to all of you gathered here, it was the greatest honor of my life to serve as your vice president, and I couldn't be more proud of the record of the Trump-Pence administration and everything that we accomplished for the American people. I actually think Silent Cal would be pretty proud of the record of the Trump-Pence administration when you think about it. He was someone who, like our administration, cut taxes and let Americans keep more of what they earn. Like Coolidge, we confronted a deadly pandemic in our time, mobilized a whole of America response, and demonstrated the extraordinary capacity of innovation in America and compassion that saved lives. And like Coolidge, we got government out of the way, rolled back more regulation than any administration in American history, and our economic policies, like his did in the 1920s, unleashed an era and a period of economic growth, 7 million good-paying jobs, unemployment at a 50-year low, and more than 10 million people lifted from welfare to work. The policies of less government and less taxes and economic freedom worked in Calvin Coolidge's time, and we put them into practice under the Trump-Pence administration every single day, and they worked again. But how times have changed. As we stand here today, 2 years into a new administration that seems in every sense to have taken our country in the opposite direction of the vision of our 13th president and that of our administration. We're taxing more, spending more. Debt is going up while wages are going down. There's lawlessness on our southern border and in the streets of our major cities. And inflation is breaking the backs of families' budgets. Now more than ever, America needs to rediscover the timeless wisdom of Calvin Coolidge and give us renewed leadership that will take us back to days of security and prosperity for all of the American people. But even as we face these historic challenges, I'm more optimistic than ever before. As I travel all across this country, I see renewed energy everywhere I go. The American people look at the record of our administration. Despite the challenges of those final days, the American people see the difference in the reckless, big government liberalism of the Biden administration. I'm optimistic because I know the character of the American people. And when given a choice between more government or more freedom, they'll choose freedom every time. And I'm optimistic because I see this new generation rising. I call them the freedom generation. It's a generation that understands intuitively the power of human freedom and human dignity. And I believe this generation will be the ones that stand on the ramparts of freedom as never before. But I'm here to give them an admonition from my own experience. Because the truth is, nothing is ever accomplished in the cause of freedom without a fight. So I want to challenge the young people here today and the extraordinary leaders that are gathered here. We need to redouble our commitment to freedom and to its cause and prepare for the fight that lies ahead. To the young people, I say, wrap your minds and hearts around not only the example of Calvin Coolidge, but the timeless wisdom of the American founding. The ideals enshrined in the Declaration of Independence and the republic described in the Constitution of the United States. Calvin Coolidge said, "The Constitution is the sole source and guarantee of national freedom." And so it is. You know, every office holder in this country, members of our military and public safety, all take the same oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic, to bear true faith and allegiance to the same. They take the obligation freely without any mental reservation or purpose of evasion. And they pledge to well and faithfully discharge the duties of the office they're about to enter. And it ends through custom and tradition with a prayer. So help me God. I took that oath many times serving alongside Congressman Cox as a member of Congress. I took it as a governor in Indiana, and I took it as your vice president. And I understood in each moment it was not just a promise that I was making to the American people, for me and my house. It was a promise we were making to Almighty God. And I want to challenge each and every one of you here today to approach that promise as American citizens in the same spirit. Because the truth is, if we lose faith in the founding principles of this country, if we lose our commitment to our Constitution, we won't just lose our way, we'll lose our country. The truth is, this generation may well be the last line of defense for the Constitution of the United States. There are forces afoot in politics today that would have us abandon the principles enshrined in the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. There are forces afoot that would pack the courts to rewrite the Constitution. But we must say, as our first president said, the Constitution is the guide I will never abandon, and live that out every day. And the American people must know, those of you that aspire to leadership, that you'll keep your oath. The Bible says in Psalm 15, he keeps his oath even when it hurts. And that must be your standard as well. Calvin Coolidge said once, "Those who want their rights respected under the Constitution ought to set the example themselves of observing the Constitution." And so you must. It's always been my aspiration, and so it will ever remain, whatever life has in store for us in the future. I know I've been much in the news lately, and I thought I might speak to that. I received word last week that the special counsel investigating President Donald Trump issued an unprecedented subpoena to compel my testimony. No vice president in American history has ever been compelled to testify against a president with whom they served. But we live in unprecedented times. I made it clear then that, consistent with the oath that I took and consistent with history, I will fight the subpoena from Biden's DOJ, and I will stand firmly on the Constitution of the United States of America. January 6th was a dark day in the history of our nation's capital. But thanks to the courage of law enforcement, the riot was quelled. We reconvened the Congress the very same day, and completed our work under the Constitution of the United States. Over the past 2 years, I've spoken and written extensively about the experiences that day. I'm proud of what we did and the stand that we took, criticized though it was by some in my own party and by the president with whom I served. But I've also made it clear that President Trump was wrong. I had no right to overturn the election. And his words that day were reckless. And they endangered my family and others at the Capitol. The American people deserve to know the truth of that day. They have every right to hold the president and others around him accountable. No one's above the law. But the supreme law of the land is the Constitution of the United States. And the Constitution forbids the executive branch from compelling an official to appear in, quote, any other place for the conduct of their duties in the legislature. And on January 6th, I was serving as president of the Senate under the express language of the Constitution. Now, this may seem obscure, but I go back to Calvin Coolidge again. Coolidge said, "There is scarcely a word in the Constitution of any of our states or of our nation that was not written there for the purpose of protecting our liberties." And I say to all the young people gathered here, the speech and debate protections in the Constitution are about preserving the separation of powers. We should, thank you. Our founders did not intend us to live in a nation where the executive could haul members of the legislature before courts to answer for what they had done in the legislature. It literally is a principle that makes its way into our Constitution at the American founding because it emerged from common law, where members of Parliament created speech and debate protections so that the king could not haul them into his courts if he disagreed with what the Parliament was doing. It is that important. And it's a position that the Department of Justice has defended on my behalf on 2 occasions over the last 2 years. Let me run that by you again. The idea that the speech and debate clause applies to the vice president in their duties presiding over the Congress of the United States was a position defended by the Department of Justice in 2 different cases involving me in the last 2 years. But something changed. And the truth is, I look at a new set of rules now, and it feels very familiar. Looks like one more example of a 2-tiered justice system where the rules tend to change when it comes to Republicans and conservatives. We've seen a Justice Department that has targeted parents for showing up at school board meetings. We've seen a Justice Department that's colluded with big tech to silence conservative voices. Equal justice under the law is at the center of the American system of justice, and we must end the double standard of this Department of Justice and their capacity to change the rules. So as I did on January 6th when I kept my oath and implemented the express language of the Constitution, as I did on January 12th, when Speaker Pelosi and Democrat leadership attempted to misuse the 25th Amendment in a punitive manner, so I will do so again in this moment. To subpoena a former president of the United States for their duties before the United States Senate is unprecedented and unconstitutional. And I would say to each and every one of you, we will fight this in our courts. We will make this case. And for so long as I live, I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States of America. So help me God. Bravo. As I close, I want to challenge the students who are joining us here today. And then Amity said we might have time for a few questions. And that is, I want you to make a lifelong commitment to becoming men and women of integrity. You know, there's a common misperception in your generation that adversity creates character. The way my kids say it is, whatever doesn't kill me makes me stronger. Well, I don't think adversity creates character. I think adversity reveals character. When hard times come and when you are pressed on your convictions, you will be in that moment the man or woman you've been preparing to be on every quiet day before. So I want to say to all those gathered here who aspire to leadership, use this time in your life to develop the qualities of the inner man and the inner woman that will make you into the kind of principled leaders that America will need in the challenging days ahead. And I'd encourage you in one other respect, and it is a value that Calvin Coolidge and I both share. And that is, understand that the foundation of America is freedom. But the foundation of freedom is faith. As Coolidge said, men do not make laws, they discover them. Timeless truths. Our founders believed we were endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights. Coolidge lived that out in his personal faith and in his public life, and so I have aspired to as well. So to the young people here today, I encourage you to take time in your life to think deeply about who He is. And remember those ancient verses that appear over the mantle in our home these last 20 years that read, I know the plans I have for you, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you a hope and a future. And I do believe that by His grace and with your leadership and courage, the best days for the greatest nation on earth are yet to come. So thank you. God bless the memory of President Calvin Coolidge, and God bless you all.
Student questions? Students, there you go. Microphone over there and then over there. Or is Audrey, that's Audrey, right? Yeah. Okay, Audrey had a good day.
Thank you. Well, it's always a good day when Vice President Pence comes to speak to us.
Thank you, Audrey.
My name is Audrey Kamina. I'm from San Francisco, California, and on behalf of the Freedom Generation, I would like to thank you deeply for the leadership, service, and work that you've done for this country in your whole career as a politician and as a great man. Thank you.
Thank you, Audrey. Very kind.
How can we as Americans preserve the legacies and heritage that we inherit from great men like Reagan, Coolidge, and yourself, and ensure that our American history isn't destroyed?
Well, I think first learn it, then teach it. You know, I got a degree in American history when I graduated from a little college in southern Indiana, which my father, a business owner, was very dubious about me getting a degree in. He thought I should study business. But my degree in American history did qualify me to get a job at the little college I graduated from in southern Indiana. But if you went to my house, you'd see stacks of books everywhere. I'm someone that really does believe that studying and learning from the examples of those that have gone before is vital. And I always tell young people, Audrey, don't read history books so much as read biographies. History is invariably simply the story of people and their lives and of families. And generally, the leaders that you might most admire, you might be surprised they didn't exactly take a straight path to where you heard of them. And so I encourage you to study history and then teach it. And then, in this generation, I have every confidence that we're going to produce leaders at every level, from our school boards to the White House, that recognize that patriotic education is essential to the survival of liberty, and we must teach our children in every school in the land about the ideals and principles of our nation's founding. That's the answer.
Hi, I'm Dustin from Houston.
Hi, Dustin.
I was wondering what things that we can do right now as the Freedom Generation to help preserve the legacy of America.
Well, I think you're doing it. But I never underestimate, and I think Calvin Coolidge lives as an example of this in the history of this country. Never underestimate the impact that one person can make. And so I would submit to you today that while getting involved in the political process and becoming a voice in your generation are all vitally important, I just encourage you, Dustin, to work on this. Work on your heart and your mind. No, there's nothing on your tie. Work on your heart and your mind right now. Become men and women of conviction and vision who understand that, what makes this country great is not so much who we are, but what we believe. I mean, think about that. I mean, my grandfather got on a boat, sailed across the Atlantic, got off onto Ellis Island. He grew up in Ireland. Anybody that thinks that Americans are exceptional and that America's unbounded prosperity and greatness and strength is a result of that we are different people than the rest of the world, I got a news flash for you. Other than our Native American brothers and sisters, we are people from the rest of the world, right? And so it's not our ethnicity, it is our creed. And our creed is in the Declaration and in the Constitution. And it's why you hear in me earlier a passion for upholding the principles enshrined in the Constitution and the objectives described there. Because I really do believe it's there, along with the grace of God, that we find the explanation for what's happened in this country. I really do believe when you think of American exceptionalism, the three pillars of American exceptionalism are our faith in God, our freedom described in our founding documents, and our vast natural resources. The combination of those three things has created a nation the likes of which the world has never known. And so study that, understand that, and in your time, be ready to defend it. And I know you will, Dustin. Thank you. Over here.
We have time for one final question.
Oh, yes. Hi, Vice President Pence. My name's Brandon. Thank you so much for coming here today. It's really an honor and a privilege.
Thank you, Brandon.
I think when you mentioned the idea of having integrity, I think that's a pivotal part of character development. And I guess one of the main questions I've had is I think bipartisanship is it's been kind of difficult in recent years, especially in Congress. There's been gridlocked Congress all throughout, and legislation has been difficult to pass. And in your experience, what do you think is the best measure to really ensure that both partisanships can really agree with one another? And yep, that's it.
Well, I always tell people, having moved back to Indiana, I said, once you get about 15 miles out of Washington, D.C., the people in this country get along pretty well. I mean, it's true. It's true. Really. American people practice the kind of civility and respect to one another in families and in businesses every single day. We just got to have government as good as our people. We've got to have government that says committed to freedom, committed to family, committed to the ideals and values of this country, but also that a government that treats one another the way the American people treat one another. And Chris and I remember it wasn't always so in Washington, D.C. I like to say, I'm a conservative, but I'm not in a bad mood about it. And I think many of the Democrats that I serve with, I have cordial relationships with today. When we faced that 100-year pandemic in COVID, the relationships that I'd built over the years, which were ultimately grounded in my desire to treat others the way I want to be treated, that's my faith demands, is it facilitated the ability to work with governors around the country and in the other party, to work with members of Congress in the other party. When you allow the personal enmity and invective to invade the political dialogue, it prevents the possibility of common ground being found. And so I would submit to you that you need to be fiercely committed to your principles, but also fiercely committed to kindness and respect. I mean, I'd never, the most liberal member of Congress that I ever served with, and I always maintained cordial relationships because I never took shots at him personally, and he never took shots at me. We knew we both came by our worldview honestly. And I think that's what the American people want us to get back to. Everywhere I go, I hear people saying that, boy, we got to get back to the policies of the Trump-Pence administration, a stronger military, growing economy, less taxes, less regulation, a secure border, conservatives on our courts. But I also hear people say, you know, can we get back to the way it was maybe when Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill used to argue over a budget, and then like a couple of good Irishmen go have a drink. And I think we can. But I just think we got to have government as good as our people. We got to find men and women who embody that kind of decency of everyday Americans. And I know we will. You know, I'm very optimistic about this future, not just because I'm looking at you, Brandon. Impressive young man. This is an impressive group of young people. But everywhere I go across this country, I'm convinced that this is a freedom-loving nation. It's a caring nation. Most compassionate nation in the history of the world. I've seen the way Americans come alongside total strangers in the worst of times. They do for people what they never expect to have done back to them. And this is truly a great nation. The challenge that we have going forward is just to have government as good as our people, as principled, as dedicated, and as caring toward one another, as the American people are every day. And I know we will, with your help and with God's grace. We'll get there. I promise you. God bless you all. Thank you for having me today. And thank you to Amity Schlaze and all the supporters of the Coolidge Foundation for a truly, truly remarkable cause.